So, you might say that we're up against a tough market today. But tough has its bonuses. Tough means challenge. And challenge can sharpen that edge of selling that probably attracted you to selling in the first place. And never forget this. Every one of our customers has individual specific needs and wants. And we have products to match every one of those needs. Well, I'd like to continue this discussion, but right now I'd like to introduce Professor Raymond Kirby. Professor Kirby is an assistant professor at the university in the social science department and a staff member at the Institute of Labor and Industrial Relations as well. And besides these distinguished credentials, Professor Kirby was a prospect of ours not so long ago. And I'm happy to report we sold him a new car. After he decided on the car, we got to talking about the economy and how people, particularly our customers, react to changing conditions. Not your usual after-the-sale discussions, but a subject of special interest to Professor Kirby and the topic of a book that he's currently writing. Professor Kirby, I'd like you to meet Gene Ambrose.
Hello, Gene.
And Jim McCarthy.
Hi.
Bill Hamilton.
Hello, Professor.
And Greg Fry.
Glad to meet you.
Professor Kirby.
Thanks, Carl.
I'd just like to add a footnote to that introduction. I not only bought from your dealership, I'm most pleased with what I bought. And let me assure you that a college professor and a mid-sized car are not your typical combination. Actually, it wasn't exactly what I originally had in mind, but it's the car that definitely meets my needs. I'd like to come back to that change in expectations later, but first, I'd like to hear how you would describe today's market. And let's be specific. How would you say today's buyer has changed in the last, say 5 years?
I'd say he's more intelligent, more sophisticated, and better informed, definitely.
He's not as loyal, but more product conscious.
And economy-minded.
I think the average prospect is more confused, uncertain about what's going on, and overextended, too.
Basically, he or she's more fearful.
Okay, what you're saying is that your prospect off the street is economy-minded and overextended, more intelligent and more confused, better informed and uncertain. An interesting profile. And how do you suppose this change in the buyer has come about? Any ideas? Greg?
Oh, I don't know. I think that one big factor, though, is that Mr. and Mrs. Car Buyer have been totally blitzed by the media over the last 5 years. Every time they turn on the tube or read a paper, bingo, instant auto education.
But then why the confusion?
Well, they've been bombarded by lots of numbers. I think they realize that there are many different things they should be aware of when they go to buy a car, but they don't know how to relate the numbers to what they need.
Oh, they don't really know what they need. It's like there's on one hand what they should buy, and on the other hand what they'd really like to buy, and they're two different vehicles.
I think maybe that makes some people a little mad at the whole idea of buying a car.
Good point. Well, you can all see what kind of a Pandora's box we've opened with one not-so-simple question. Let's just do a little digging at the roots of the problem. Every day, literally thousands of people are faced with the problem of inadequate transportation. They have 3 possible solutions. One, they can give up driving. 2, they can invest more money to recondition their current vehicle. Or 3, they can buy a new car. To give up driving in a country like ours is impractical. For an overwhelming majority of people, To drive or not to drive is simply not the question. Spending more money to recondition a car built 3 or 4 years ago doesn't make good sense in terms of MPGs or the car's resale value. So, when someone with the need to do something about their transportation situation becomes a prospect for a new car, that person has made a wise decision. But now, that person has a new problem. What kind of car to buy? From my recent observations, I've been able to make several generalizations about where the prospect is coming from these days. And incidentally, we're seeing similar attitudes develop toward the products of other industries. As you can see, lettering has never been my strong suit. Number 1, your prospect is uncertain and confused. Number 2, your prospect thinks buying by numbers, fuel mileage figures, and price is the only solution. 3, your prospect concludes that smaller is always best. 4, your prospect believes that foreign car manufacturers make the best cars. And 5, your prospect distrusts automobile salespeople. Distrusts you, the very person who is best qualified to determine his or her real transportation needs and recommend an appropriate transportation solution. For the sake of illustration, let's talk about a college professor who happily ends up buying a mid-sized car. This college professor has been to several foreign car dealerships looking for a new compact car. He would have been happy to replace his 4-year-old foreign compact with one that could, if possible, get even better gas mileage. He stopped in at a GM dealership out of curiosity, just to see what's been cooking on the North American burner. He drives away in his first mid-sized car. So what happened? Let's say you each helped sell me. As Carl mentioned, I am currently working on a book about customer responses to today's market conditions, particularly with respect to the purchase of big-ticket items. So, as I've been shopping around for a new car, I've been doing some on-the-spot research. When I first came into your dealership, I explained to your sales manager what I had in mind and offered him the opportunity to give me his pitch after I completed my research. At the time, Jim here was on the phone with what sounded like a customer that had previously bought from him.
Well, Mr. White, I'm pleased you've been satisfied with the car and our service. And I'd really like the opportunity to show you some of our new models one of these days. Yes, those smaller models you mentioned do get better mileage than the car you're driving now. But then so does this year's model of that same car. Could we make an appointment for tomorrow afternoon? Or would Friday at 3 be more convenient? I've got some information you might want to look over before you make up your mind. We like to keep tabs on the inflation situation and how we're doing. You can just look it over. And while you're here, I'll show you some of our new models. With the particular needs of your family, I think you'll find we've got the car that can...
Generalization number 1. Your prospect is uncertain and confused. Common responses for a person who feels that he or she is losing control of a situation. 2 major factors in today's market encourage that feeling: inflation and the energy situation. How did you handle the issue of inflation when Mr. White came in?
Did he come in, Jim?
Oh, he came in all right. The thing is, I'm helpless. I can't do anything about inflation, and neither can my prospects. But I can keep informed on the situation to avoid appearing to be ignorant as well as helpless. But you know, part of what people are afraid of is how bad things might be. They just don't know. I keep a chart on our local conditions. I call it the inflation factor. It helps put things in perspective. I used the last decade, the 70s, as a yardstick on inflation's impact in our city on different spending areas.
Where do you get your information on inflation, Jim?
Oh, originally I read a newspaper article about inflation, and I copied a chart from it. Now I update and add to the chart when I'm reading the paper. Prospects appreciate and look up to you if you're someone who knows even part of the inside story. They figure they can trust you to help them. You know, though, Professor, I had a harder time convincing Mr. White not to buy down than I did convincing him not to put off buying a new car this year.
Good point, Jim. I'd say that impulse to buy down represents another way that your prospect tries to control a situation in which he feels he has no control, until you help him feel in control again by giving him the facts.
When I can give them the information that relates to their needs, prospects give me their attention, their respect. Not just because I know what's going on, but because I'm concerned about their concerns.
Now I'd like to replay one of Jim's replies to Mr. White, adding my own emphasis. Yes, those smaller models you mentioned do get better mileage than the car you're driving now. But then so does this year's model of that same car. It sounds like Mr. White is feeling the tug of another string. The threat of limited and more expensive fuel can cause your prospects to quietly panic and develop one or more of these false assumptions. A, buying by numbers. Fuel mileage figures and price is the only solution. B, smaller is always best, even when you have to sacrifice comfort and convenience. And C, foreign manufacturers make the best cars. You understand I hadn't expected to see all three of these assumptions in action. It appears this dealership is busy being visited by today's typical prospect. At any rate, I was very interested in how each of you helped free your prospects of the energy strain, and I'd like to share my observations with you. Shortly after noon on the day of my visit, Jean approached a couple in their late 40s, early 50s.
My name's Jean Ambrose. May I help you?
Sam Klein, and this is my wife, Irene.
Nice to meet you.
We're just looking. Comparison shopping, you might say.
And how do we seem to be measuring up?
Well, it's kind of hard to say. We've seen ads with good mileage ratings, but no prices listed. And we've seen ads with good, well, relatively good prices, but no mileage ratings. So, we've come in here to see how much the most miles per gallon costs.
It can be confusing with so many numbers and so little specific information that applies to your individual needs in a car.
What do you mean?
Well, advertising is geared to reach a large and diverse group of people. So it addresses the two common issues that are on everybody's minds these days: price and miles per gallon. Those are two big headlines that get everybody's attention. Also, those are two areas that appear to be easy to compare because they involve numbers. Sometimes when such a big decision seems confusing, we all like to fall back on what seems to be the most scientific.
What do you mean, what seems to be?
Well, if everyone's transportation needs were exactly the same, we'd just compile a list of all the cars in North America and toss their mileage ratings and prices into a computer. Then we'd let the computer rank them from most desirable to least desirable. The problem is that that wouldn't really be a very good way to decide what kind of car is most or least desirable for your specific needs.
Well, I guess you've got a point there, but then what do we go by? High fuel mileage and a low price are two of our needs.
Yes, but what she's saying is that they're two of everybody's needs. We have other needs as well, Sam.
Exactly. Now that's approaching the problem with a total perspective. You know, I think you'll be pleased to know that all car models on the market are getting better mileage than those from the mid-70s. In fact, during the last half of the 70s, GM fuel mileage, taken as an average across all car lines, improved 39.5, almost 40%. You know, what's just as interesting is that you can actually influence the number of miles you get per gallon by the way you drive. Your own personal driving habits can make a difference. But let's set the numbers aside and talk about how you'll be using your car. That's the best way to figure out what those other needs are. Now, Mrs. Klein, we'll start with you. For example,
Beautiful counseling, Gene. You were tuned in to the client's fears. Consequently, you were able to cut the strings and guide them to a more rational approach. Moving right along, smaller is best. Ah, yes, guilty as charged. While I was in your dealership, I had a chance to observe how Bill was able to respond to a prospect's insistence on this point with some good questions. Let's face it, your prospects know that the smaller cars are in high demand, and the nature of dealership specials says to them that you're pushing the bigger models. But Bill's prospects certainly could have fooled me. Single, young, a sure shot for a smaller car, right?
And a tape deck and air conditioning are both must. About how long will I have to wait?
Just to make sure we're on the right track, I'd like to ask you a few questions.
Look, this is what I want. I've got to get rid of that old clunker.
I notice you're driving one of our competition's larger models. About 5 years old, huh?
It's a gas-guzzling dinosaur. I'll be glad to see it go.
You know, you could buy just about any car on the market today and still get better mileage than with that particular model. But that's really beside the point. I'd like to get an idea of how you're going to use our new car.
Well, I'm going to be driving it a lot. That's why I wanted a smaller car. Better mileage and all that. I'm a consultant to elementary schools for a government-funded reading program, so I often drive to an area, then I visit a number of schools throughout the week.
Miss Carlisle, one thing that I think you might give a second thought to is the possible sacrifice of comfort you may be making. Do you ever carry passengers?
No, well, not to different cities. Sometimes I do take the school principals out to lunch when I'm in the area, but that doesn't really happen very often.
Oh, I'm sure you'd be comfortable in the smaller car, but in your situation, long hours in the car and occasional passengers, you might be more comfortable in a larger model. You don't have to sacrifice comfort for improved mileage these days, especially for city driving. The mileage ratings between the two models aren't that far apart. Over the course of a year's time, there'll be relatively insignificant difference in the operating costs of the two cars. Also, with a larger model, you'd get better driving range. A bigger tank means less time in gas stations and lines.
I don't know. What would the difference in mileage be between my old car and the new one, in the city, for instance?
A sure shot for a smaller car, right, Bill?
Wrong, Professor.
Could you show her those figures, Bill?
Oh, well, yes, sir. After a demonstration ride, the car sold itself. She really wanted the comfort of a larger car. She just needed help in being able to see comfort as an important need. She was happy to take delivery of the new car the very same week she made the decision to buy, too.
No. I won't let you say that the car sold itself. No way. First, you slowed your prospect down, and then you got enough information to cut that prospect string. You proved her unspoken assumption false. Smaller is not always best. Sometimes, though, and I think Greg will agree with me on this next statement, you probably wish that your prospect believed that small is best. Your small, that is. Many small car prospects believe that foreign manufacturers make the best cars. And yes, you're right. I was guilty on the second count as well. Greg, however, dealt with a case of foreign car mystique with such diplomacy so as to convince a diehard like myself to question my convictions.
Pretty nice, huh?
Well,
What do you think?
well, I don't know. I mean, she really does drive nicely, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But I've been checking out some of the imports, and, well, I'm just not convinced that our comparable cars are up to par, if you know what I mean.
Well, once upon a time, that was a pretty common feeling. In fact, I myself, for a period of time, drove a set of foreign wheels. But since I've had a chance to drive our smaller cars, as well as our luxury models, man, I'm sold. There's no doubt in my mind about what I'd buy now.
Yeah, but everybody knows that the Japanese and the European car makers have been making these small cars a lot longer than we have.
Hey, we've made more cars for more years, for more people, and we're used to making the kind of cars that people like you and me have come to expect. Small and luxury cars are nothing new to us. All of our cars are quality engineered. We can equip your car the way you want it. The foreigns can't offer you the flexibility of options, match mileage ratings, and save you money. And besides, our dealership can provide you with better service, and better parts availability after you buy the car. What do you say?
Well, I better think about it, you know. I really like the way she handles. Why don't I give you a call, okay?
Listen, sure, I'd like to sell you a car, but I'd also like to sell you on an idea. Just because something's made in a foreign country doesn't mean it's better. Think about that.
Well, did he?
Well, I'm sorry to say that this was not another success story. Well, not yet, that is. And yet, in another way, I guess it already has been. Because I've had to put my knowledge of different foreign imports through a real workout. You know, I needed the brushing up, and he's coming around. He's just waiting for graduation. When he gets his diploma, I expect I'll get a signed order.
Greg, I'd just like to point out a couple of things you did that day that really impressed me. You empathized with your prospect. You let him know that you were a person like him. You had also owned a foreign car. You had shared his doubts. Those things gave you credibility.
Well, I guess that sort of thing just comes naturally because of coincidence. I mean, some of these things really did happen to me, too. But I believed in what I told him. My generation and younger have just been caught up in this foreign car thing. Some of them are still missing out on some of the great things that are happening right here at home. You know, some of our mid-sized cars can top some of these people's used foreign cars in terms of miles per gallon, and yet I hear them justifying their choice of the foreign imports by saying that they want to get the same great mileage that they're getting out of their current foreign cars. Well, that's crazy.
You know, that's an interesting point.
After spending the day listening to you people, I was no longer convinced that foreign car makers could make the best car for me. I was no longer convinced that smaller was always best. I was no longer convinced that numbers were going to point the way. I was a man without a generalization. A person might be operating on the most irrational assumption in the world, but if you aim to prove that conviction unsound, if you take that person's pillar of faith away, you've got to give him something else to go on. And don't forget, after dealing with these first four generalizations today, we still have the crowning blow to come to grips with. Your typical prospect, that's me, distrusts automobile salespeople. To be quite frank, however, by the end of my day's observations at your dealership, I didn't distrust automobile salespeople anymore. Why do you think that this was the case, Carl?
Well, Ray, I think all of us here sell by directing our buyer's interest. From what I heard today, if I had to outline the ideal counseling procedure for a salesperson, it'd go something like this. First, slow the prospect down so that second, you can understand where the prospect is coming from. And the only way to do that is to listen to the prospect. Third, and this is showing them that you understand, empathize with their feelings. Fourth, give them the facts, some information to get them to objectively look at their irrationality of their approach and to let you take control of the situation. Fifth, and Ray, correct me if I'm wrong here, this step has to do with giving them something to go on, and that is to ask questions to determine their individual needs. Sixth would be to make a recommendation of a vehicle that A, meets their needs, and B, that we can put them into today. And seventh, justify the recommendation with answers that they gave you to your questions. As Gene implied, this is the real, truly professional way to do it. And that seems to be the way that each of you is counseling your prospects.
You get an A+. Very nice analysis. Very nice. Couldn't have said it better myself. Directing buyer's interest. When I finally got together with Carl, after I was done with my observations, I was curious to find out how he'd approach me. Thanks to observing you folks, I had effectively been slowed down, understood, and given the facts. Like I said before, I was ready for something besides generalizations. And it wasn't new generalizations that put me in that mid-size car. It was my own answers to questions that your sales manager put to me that did it. I think Carl here might be more of an authority on how to develop your counseling questions. I'm sold proof of his expertise. Thank you. Jim, Gene, Bill, Greg, Carl.
Ray, we expect to see you back here when it's time to trade in that car. Okay, before we close this morning, I'd like to get us to thinking about what kinds of questions will help us get specific information from our buyer prospects. Now, I'm going to open the floor for suggestions. Remember that questions that zero in on how the car is going to be used and what are the prospect's needs and wants, these are the sort of things we'll be aiming for. Okay, Gene?
What kind of car are you driving now? What do you like about it?
What do you dislike about it? Do you use your car to commute to work?
To drive customers to lunch?
To go on vacation.
How many kids do you have?
Do you haul a boat or a trailer?
How much time do you spend in your car daily? How many miles a year do you drive?
How much of that is city driving?
And what about options?